Hi, everyone. This is Lori from NTI again. I apologize. We're having a little bit of technical difficulties over here, which is a nice way to say that I clicked the wrong button and disconnected everyone. But we're here now, and we're going to get started. So thank you for your patience, and I hope everyone can hear me now. I would like to welcome everyone to today's webinar. On behalf of the National Transit Institute, I welcome you and thank you for participating. The National Transit Institute develops, promotes, and delivers training and education programs for the public transit industry in the United States. Today's webinar is the relationship between transit asset condition and service quality and is based on TCRP Project E-11, which was released as TCRP Report 198. We are pleased to have as our presenters today Bill Robert of Spy Pond Partners and Bob Peskin and Mark Gordon of AECOM. Today's session will consist of Bill, Bob, and Mark presenting their material, followed by a question and answer session at the end. You can participate in this discussion by using the chat pod that is located in the lower left bottom of the screen. I see that some of you have located it already. If you have questions during the presentation, I will be monitoring the chat box and I will be saving your questions, so we will address them at the end. So feel free to chat up at any time. If you have not already printed out a copy of the presentation that was emailed to you, you can click on the handout document in the upper left-hand corner of your screen where it says Handouts, or you can copy and paste the link in the notes box. There's two options there. Some people have trouble with Google Drive. They're not clickable, but if you copy and paste in your browser, that should work. I've also included a copy in the handout section of TCRP Report 198 if you want to download that as well. That takes care of everything, and let's get started. I will now turn the presentation over to Bill.
Well, thanks, Lori, and thanks everybody for joining this webinar. As Lori said, the topic of today's webinar is the relationship between transit, asset condition, and service quality. This slide just summarizes the agenda for today's talk. We'll try to wrap up all our talking at the 1 hour mark so that we have ample time for any questions and discussion. I'll give a brief overview of the TCRP project that led to TCRP Report 198. Then I'll turn things over to Bob Peskin of AECOM to talk about the framework for relating asset condition to service quality. We'll review some case studies that we looked at in the research demonstrating this relationship. And then Mark Gordon will talk about one of the case studies for the New Zealand Transport Agency, and then present on the calculation guidance we developed. And then finally, we'll talk about a set of calculation spreadsheets that we developed to calculate effective journey time, which is the main metric of service quality we developed as part of the research. There'll be three presenters, myself, Bob Peskin, and Mark Gordon. I'm from Spy Pond Partners. This is a consulting firm located in Arlington, Massachusetts. Bob and Mark are from AECOM. So now what I'd like to do is just give a brief overview of TCRP Project E-11, which is the research project that led to Report 198. And again, I'd like to encourage everybody to download Report 198 if you've not done so, along with the spreadsheet tools that we'll be talking about later in today's webinar. So this project was initiated because there's an interest in trying to improve our understanding of how physical asset conditions relate to the service quality that transit users experience. There's been previous research on the topic of how conditions impact transit agency costs, and just to recap all that research, if you've got state of good repair, SGR needs, in front of you, and you don't address them and return your system to a state of good repair, well, those needs don't really go away. If anything, they get greater over time as it becomes necessary to rehabilitate an asset rather than repair it, or replace an asset rather than rehabilitate it. And also, operating and maintenance costs tend to increase for assets operated beyond their useful economic life. So this has been established through prior research, but what wasn't very well established was the impact of those conditions on the quality of service from the transit user's perspective. And there's a lot of dimensions to transit service quality, and Bob will talk about that in a minute. And it's very hard to decouple asset condition from all the different factors that impact service quality. At the same time, through the research, we wanted to make this connection to help transit agencies make better informed decisions about how to invest their resources. So the objective of the research project was to provide guidance on relating asset condition to service quality, and also through the research develop a set of empirical relationships for demonstrating this relationship. The project team included Spy-Pond partners, AECOM, and also individual consultant Harry Cohen, Brian McCollum from McCollum Management Consulting, Steve Solkunis, and Dave Hughes. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Bob to talk about the framework relating condition and service quality.
Okay, thanks, Bill. Lori, if you can advance the slide, I seem to have lost the pointer for advancing the slide. This figure illustrates the overall relationship between asset condition, service quality, and customer impact, particularly ridership. It's driven very much by the preceding research, both work by the TCRP program and work by the Federal Transit Administration, particularly in developing its Transit Asset Management Guide. It begins with the recognition that asset condition declines over time, and this is the result of both age and utilization. The impact of asset condition degrading over time has an impact in asset performance, measured by failures, and increased cost to operate those assets. The degraded condition of the assets, both their appearance and how well they perform in terms of reliability, is perceived by the customer, both in terms of increased travel time, plus increased wait time to the extent that, particularly to the extent that the customer's perception of reliability is encouraging them to arrive earlier for scheduled service, for example. The perceived increase in travel time is part of the heart of the research that was undertaken, examining a combination of both real and perceived changes in travel time, and that then was used to come up with a measure that we'll be talking about in some coming slides. This reduction or increase in travel time is perceived by the customer as a reduction in the level of service provided. We reference in this diagram TCRP report 165, which addresses quality of service, and that report introduces an important definition of quality of service, which is the overall measured or perceived performance of transit service from the passenger's point of view. And I really emphasize that perspective because it is customer perception that in part is driving a lot of the research that was undertaken as part of this project. Bill mentioned a literature review that was undertaken early in the research effort, which revealed a series of dimensions of how customers receive transit service, how they perceive it. They're measured on this slide and on the next, and is described at some length in the report. These attributes of service quality were applied in developing a common measure to address service quality in the context of asset condition changing over time. the measure that was developed as part of the research we're calling effective journey time. And it is an index, a measure of service quality. It attempts to reduce all of the considerations from the prior two slides into a single comprehensive measure that incorporates these various components that we've indicated. The actual time that the passenger is in the transit vehicle or waiting for the transit vehicle, what we're calling buffer time, which is additional time that the passenger is providing for the trip, recognizing the underlying reliability of the service, which, as we mentioned in the diagram, degrades, well, the quality of service degrades over time, and the passenger is likely to increase the amount of buffer time that they allow in their journey. The EJT measure also provides for a set of adjustment factors to address more detailed components of the passenger's perception of the trip. And those adjustment factors were derived or were identified in the research and the literature review, and the report talks about specific values that are assigned to those adjustment factors. This diagram provides an example of the application of the EJT math. We're presenting two scenarios, a before state of good repair or SGR investment and after SGR investment. And there's two bars for each. The first is the raw time actually experienced by the customer, and the second bar, which is longer than the first, is a factored version of the first, which includes these factors that I just mentioned that allow for differences in customer perception for different components of the time actually experienced. And what we see in this diagram is that the unadjusted travel time before and after the SGR investment reduces by about 5.8 minutes, or just over a 30% savings in travel time. With the adjustments, the perceived travel time is reduced by 6.8 minutes, another minute in perception. The percentage reduction, however, is about the same as the unadjusted time. This measure is similar, this EJT measure is similar to a measure that's being used by London Underground, what they call a journey time metric. A very similar set of considerations, which is addressing both in-vehicle time and wait time and various components of the trip experience, including the walking that the customer has to do both on flat surfaces and in vertical circulation as well. So there's some real-world basis for this, and similar or an example of an actual application elsewhere. We think that this measure is useful in several ways. One, it provides a baseline value for a particular service. It provides a basis for then comparing scenarios, looking at different levels of investment, different scenarios. And it provides an opportunity to do a computation of excess travel time or cost. I would point out that the EJT is measured in units of time, minutes in this case, but that could be converted to a cost measure by applying the traveler's value of time. This information, we think, can be useful in comparing alternative investment schemes, provides a convenient measure for quantifying the impact, and could be used as both the raw value or as a ratio type value, for example, EJT per passenger or per passenger mile. Some other examples indicated on this slide. It's not a perfect measure. So far, the examples have been applied for a specific route or origin-destination pair. A system-wide application would seem to be a good application of this approach, and is certainly one worthwhile exploring. And we're certainly seeing examples of transit agencies beginning to measure system-wide traveler delay time, an indication of the worthwhileness of that sort of an approach. While we go through a lot of our math using these adjustment factors, it's also perfectly reasonable to consider an approach where the adjustment factors are not applied, and that's worthy of further discussion. Bill, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thanks, Bob. So now what I'm going to do is talk about a set of case studies that were performed as part of our research. Once we had developed this framework relating service quality and asset condition, the next part of the research was to try to evaluate whether we saw this relationship play out in practice. So a set of case studies were performed as part of the research, and we attempted to address as many different modes and agency sizes and other types of situations as we could through our different case studies. So we'll talk about 4 case studies. Case study 1 was with a New England transit agency where we looked at one heavy rail line and computed EJT both before and after replacement of that agency's rail fleet. And the fleet replacement occurred at the same general period that the agency made a set of improvements to its fixed guideway to reduce slow zones. Case study 2 is with a mid-Atlantic agency, so it's another transit system where we looked at EJT on a representative day with and without a major guideway failure. In this particular case, the agency has tap-in and tap-out fare cards, so what we focused on was whether our model for predicting EJT matched the actual fare card data. Case study 3, we looked at an agency in the western U.S. and in particular looked at a bus route to see how EJT varies over time for a representative bus route as the fleet ages. And then the 4th case study was really a set of analyses performed for different transit systems in New Zealand, and Mark Gordon will talk about that one, and in that particular case study we focused on a simplified approach to calculating EJT, borrowing concepts from New Zealand's Economic Evaluation Manual. So I'll go into a little bit more detail on each of the first 3 case studies and then turn things over to Mark. So in case study 1, again, we were looking at a legacy heavy rail line. It had been around for quite a while. As of 2006, the rail fleet was at the end of its useful life, or beyond it, depending on how exactly you characterize the useful life of heavy rail vehicles. There were also extensive slow zones on the line, so approximately 10 minutes was added for a train trip as a result of the slow zones relative to the time the line could have run out without slow zones. And then by 2012, the fleet had been replaced. There's a new fleet that had been purchased and put into service, and the slow zones had been reduced to a pretty low level as a result of a set of investments in state of good repair and just overall increase in maintenance of the line. So the benefits that we saw through the case study were that the EJT savings is approximately 4 minutes per trip, and this is equivalent to an annual benefit of $18 million. There's additional agency cost savings. Here in the case study, we were just focused on the impact of these investments on service quality. So then the table at right just shows you the EJT that we predicted before and after the improvements. peak and off-peak, and we saw similar kinds of improvements, peak and off-peak. Case study 2, this is where we were looking at the Mid-Atlantic Transit Agency. We looked at a typical day in April 2016, and then one particular day where there was a really big guideway failure. Basically, the electric current was arcing on the track in near in a pretty key part of the network, and this resulted in single tracking of a large portion of the line during the AM peak and part of the midday period. For the passengers that were directly impacted, it caused a delay of up to 40 minutes. So what we did in this case is we used fare card data to first calibrate our EJT model for the typical day and then model the day where we had the incident. This particular slide shows you a heat map, and in this heat map it's showing the increase in travel time on the day where we had the incident relative to a typical day. And the way to interpret this is that there's the origins are plotted along the horizontal axis, the destinations of the passengers are plotted along the vertical axis, and the increase in time is shown as a color. And so green is good, yellow is an additional 5 to 10 minutes, and then the darker the color after that, the greater the delay. And so in the graph we've circled where there are examples of where there was just a little bit of delay, and then examples where there was a lot of delay, and then also an arrow points to the station where the incident occurred. And what we saw in this particular case study was that our model and actual results compared pretty well. So in the baseline, the actual journey time was 26 minutes per passenger, but this included time on other lines because there's other lines we weren't modeling. So the estimated actual journey time on the line that was impacted was 19 minutes, and we modeled 19 minutes. The effective journey time that we modeled was 26 minutes. This includes time for adjustments due to the quality of travel. And then on the day that the Guideway incident occurred, the actual journey time was 43.5 minutes. The time on the impacted line was about 35 minutes. We modeled about 33 minutes. So not an exact match, but a pretty good match. And indeed, we saw, we saw the effects of the incident in EJT. And it was actually a greater impact in terms of effective journey time than actual journey time because the quality of the travel was so degraded as a result of the incident. Then in case study 3, this is the case where we looked at a bus line operated by a Western U.S. transit agency. So we model this agency's assets are in good repair, so when we modeled existing EJT, we're modeling a case where things are running as well as they realistically can. And what we did was from there, modeled what would happen as the fleet aged and conditions were worsened. And what we saw is that it made a big difference to include the comfort factors in the calculation. And if we don't include the comfort factor, then the increase in the effective cost of a trip as we go from today to an increased age, shown here along the horizontal axis, went up by about 2 cents per trip. But if we included the adjustment factors, the increase was about 14 cents per trip over time. Obviously, 14 cents doesn't sound like a lot, but if you multiply 14 cents by each trip for the bus route per day and by 365 days a year, then it starts to add up. So in all 3 of these cases, we saw that we were able to model EJT, and that gave us some confidence about our model. But with this, I'll turn things over to Mark to talk about the 4th case study for New Zealand transit agencies.
Thanks, Bob. And Laurie, if you could please advance the slides for me as well, that would be great. Thank you. So this story actually begins around 30 years ago. in New Zealand when we had a deregulation of the passenger transport industry, as we call it here. And we moved from an era of services being provided by local councils in good quality buses to one where the commercial imperative kind of reigned. And we saw a sudden drop-off in quality of the bus fleet, and with that, a sudden drop of patronage which occurred over a number of years. Over time, that was remedied. NZTA, which is the co-funder of transport services, both road and transit, came in and started to increase thresholds for the condition of the bus fleet. And part of that was informed by customer research, willingness to pay surveys, so going and finding out what it was that troubled customers when using buses, and it was pretty obvious. It started to lift the bar. At the same time, our economic evaluation manual was developed, and while that over time had largely related to roads investments, with this information that was coming through for transit, procedures for how you could evaluate the economic value of doing certain things, new projects or state of good repair works, started to come through. And I've got a slide on the EAM which I will share with you in a moment. And it uses similar range of quality of service attributes as the E11 study, and you can see some of them there: reliability, service frequency, etc., etc. For those of you that are interested, the manual itself is at that website at the bottom of that slide. So go to the next. The data the slide is not where I thought it was, but that's okay. What we found though was, because of the commercial side, we weren't able to get a lot of information around condition, but what is available in the public space is good data on satisfaction, and you can see there one of our cities, Auckland, and the different attributes of satisfaction over time. Overall satisfaction, availability, frequency, etc. for Auckland bus fleet. On the right-hand side, we moved south to Christchurch, where we looked at the information that was available, in this case bus arrival time, and tried to see if there's any correlation with age as a potential surrogate for condition. But as you can see, not really. The R value is pretty small. So, you know, what we derive from that is that we can definitely understand our customer concerns by looking at satisfaction and drivers of satisfaction, but using age data just wasn't conclusive. So the next slide will show an example from the EEM. And what the EEM does is provides you with a suite of the service attributes, and using the information that's been researched through customers and potential users, what is the value of time that people would place on different attributes of service? Now, I've only got a couple here, cleanliness and comfort, but you can see if you look at the first, litter. If I'm riding on a bus which is clean, there's no bits of paper and litter scattered everywhere, to me that's worth 0.4 of a minute of my journey time. Okay, and you can see the others there around graffiti, exterior, interior, etc. At the top of that slide, Bob mentioned buffer time and adjustments. And what we see here for the reliability factor is that these are the adjustment factors that would be applied to the travel time, to the wait time. So, for example, departure. If the bus is, say, 2 minutes late, then in our economic manual, we can apply a factor of 5 to that. So it would make it a 10-minute equivalent journey of time. Next. This takes this information a little bit further and applies the time value of money. So Bob mentioned that we can take the EJT and then start to use that in economic evaluation by applying a dollar rate of time. In New Zealand, we have these values. Supposedly the work travel purpose is worth a lot more than other purposes at $21.70 in New Zealand an hour, compared to, say, non-work at $3.05 if you're sitting on a bus or a train. What we've then done, and there are examples in the manual and the guide, is to say, well, let's apply that. What might that look like if we took a bus or a fleet of buses, and let's multiply that up over a year. So in this example, 36,000 trips per passenger per year, or passenger trips a year. We've got a very old bus, pretty poor condition, bad ride, no air conditioning, probably about the worst bus you can imagine. And we're going to replace that with a brand new one, all the mod cons, air conditioning, all of those sorts of things. And in this example, we applied a 4-minute travel time saving, which is a lot on every trip, but for the sake of demonstration. In the table below, you can see how that multiplies up using the various hourly rates, adjustment factors, and we've costed here the reliability, cleanliness facilities, and ride. You can see here the reliability totally dominated. Probably the assumption of 4 minutes is far too much. But you can see what we've done. We've taken an EJT value of time, put some dollar per hour rates on it, and we've come up with what's essentially an annual user benefit. And that's a number you can use going forward in economic evaluation. But that is actually for the next project, E12, which we're not here to talk about today. Next slide. So in conclusion, and looking at these 4 case studies and examples, we can say 5 things. Firstly, that the EJT model, we can use it to illustrate the impacts on service quality of changes in asset condition and changes in the service attributes that we provide on those buses or vehicles. Secondly, we believe these studies demonstrate results for buses and rail systems, and there are a variety of approaches that can be used, and Bill will work through some of that with us shortly. Thirdly, that adjusting for customer perceptions, you know, the litter, the cleanliness, whatever it might be, those attributes of service can have an impact on the results and help drive the benefits of achieving state of good repair. Fourth, the model developed appears to reproduce actual journey times pretty well, and it's good to get data and good to have the data. It's certainly preferable. And finally, we need spreadsheet tools and to develop those to facilitate the calculation of EJT resulting from changes in asset condition. So that's the case studies, and I'll turn now to the guidance on the tool and run through the process with you on that. So next slide. And another. So basically we've got 5 steps here, 5 basic steps, running from the scope of the analysis through the data, the calculation approach, which is the best for us to use, then run the calculations, the model, and summarise the results. So in step 1, the next slide, we look at determining the scope of the analysis, and here, you know, what are the decisions that we are going to make? It might be that we just want to look at a single vehicle, which was essentially the example I explained a minute ago, or we might want to look at a whole fleet. We might be looking at a route, you know, a track route from A to B, or we might be looking at things we want to do at a station. We might be wanting to develop a whole program across our portfolio of SGR investments. So that's a much bigger undertaking than the first 2. And we also want to know when's the best time to do this. Is it this year, next year, or in 5 years' time? So that's what the decisions are. What is the future case? So here we're looking at scenarios. So we're going to have we may have a base case which just says we'll do nothing. We'll just let deterioration run. Things can get worse, and we'll just take a totally reactive approach. Or we might want to make more proactive investments. It might be state of good repair, or it might be capital improvement of some form, and our double EM manual actually looks at both. We can also look at the what ifs. You know, what if we get a major track failure here, or what if the electricity goes down because of some fault over here? So we can test those sorts of things as well. Next. The assets, the vehicles, the guideways, the systems, the stations, all or any of those. Specific lines or routes, single, multiple, or the system, and the analysis time frame. It's good economic practice to look at a longer term, otherwise you do get influenced by short-term financial constraints. A longer term is certainly better to look at the life cycle. And the next. So we go from the scope to the data needs, and we may not have a lot of data, and that's certainly going to influence the approach that we can have or can take. But the basic data we really should have and need is the headway, the length of a route if we're looking at a route, or vehicle miles, vehicle speed, age and life, and failure rate. So those are all the important aspects that we should have some data for. We can make assumptions if we don't have good data, and you know, if we don't have good records, for example, of how a bus or a vehicle ages and how the failure rate, breakdown rate changes over time, then we need to make an assumption about how that will change from new to old. The delays per passenger, how much, I assume 4 minutes before, what is the delay that we're testing here, and then what those adjustment factors will be, and there's some standard factors that come through on the research there. There's other things too that we need to look at for data if we're doing a comprehensive analysis on the next slide, such as origin, destination, pairs, vehicles per consist, all of those sorts of things that you can see there are all of the sorts of things that we can put in a model. Time spent waiting at the station, time spent waiting at a bus stop in the rain, all of those sorts of things. Next slide. So we move now to the calculation approach, and essentially we provide two approaches in our tool and methodology. The simplified and the comprehensive. So simplified if we're looking at a small system, a single route, or an easy decision, particularly if we don't have that origin destination data, or maybe if we just want to test sensitivity and say if we will change that factor, what would happen, what might the answer be. So we can use a simplified approach there. For those of you that want to do this well and in depth and have the really good data, the comprehensive approach is there for us. You know, we've got a bigger system, we've got the good data, and if it helps us to understand what we're doing along the way, we can map it out. So the next slide, the spreadsheet, we have a spreadsheet model that Bill will work us through shortly, and that is there for both the simplified and the comprehensive. Obviously we have the different scenarios. We want to be able to run that, the base case, and any one or more of other potential scenarios. And we can, if we're using a simplified approach, we can check if some different origin destination pairs, look at that one, run the model, look at another one, run the model, and build up a picture. So different approaches there. To the next. To summarise, what do we get from all of these different approaches? Well, we certainly get an EJT per passenger for each scenario, and with that we can apply the economics and build up a picture of the annual effect. We can look at obviously the percentage change and compare scenario A with scenario B back to the base. We can annualise those results, build it up to a per year, and then build it into a a longer-term life cycle analysis of our system, and from that we can then compare with different options that we might have for developing or replacing aspects of our system. So it's an approach. Qualitative is what I kind of showed you in the E11, but we can actually make that much more quantitative, bring in our maintenance costs as well associated with breakdowns, and this is really, E11 is the first part, I think, of a two-part project which E12 will take further and take it into the actual economics of making investments in state of good repair. So I think, Bill, it's back to you to walk us through the tool.
Okay, thanks, Mark. So now what I'm going to do is turn to talk about the specific models that were developed as part of the research, and I'll show the calculation spreadsheets, or at least screenshots from the spreadsheets, and walk through the inputs that are needed for that. But just one thing, just to underscore what Mark said, is that we understand that obviously the relationship between condition and service quality is really important. But if you're doing an SGR analysis, this might just be one factor that you consider along with lots of other factors. So that's what we're focused on in this research, but as Mark indicated, this could just be one dimension of an overall problem that you might be looking at. So as Mark said, there's two versions of the calculation tool. We're calling it the EJT calculator, a simplified version and a comprehensive version. Both these tools are available for download. They're designed to run in Microsoft Excel 2010 or higher. And if you're using the comprehensive tool, you will need to enable macros. It doesn't make extensive use of macros, but macros are used to navigate around the tool. So it'll be a little frustrating if you don't have macros enabled. Within the tools, there are a lot of inputs, particularly in the comprehensive tool, but what we've tried to do is have default values wherever there's an input, and you can see a default value, and you can use that or you can override it. We've tried to make the tools user-friendly. You can let us know what you think, but at the same time, we want all the calculations and all the to be there for somebody who wants to dig into the details. So if you have the spreadsheet open and you really want to dig into it, you might want to unprotect the sheets so that you can see everything, and in some cases tabs or other headings are removed, so you can go to preference and just enable that stuff if you really want to dive into the details. But we've tried to have it so that the tool is kind of easy to use as reasonably possible, run out of the box. So first I'll talk about the simplified model. A screenshot of that is shown on the right side of this slide. And basically what this tool is doing is a relatively small number of inputs are needed, and it calculates EJT for a route. And it will predict the values for a base case and for different time points, and then also show you a graph of how EJT will vary over time. This slide is zoomed in, and it shows the basic parameters that are needed to run the tool. So you need to say what kind of vehicle are you interested in, and if it's a train, how many vehicles are there per consist. And I'll try the pointer. We'll see how that goes. Never mind. And how long is the route? What's the average headway? What's the average vehicle speed? What's the useful life of my fleet, and what is the average fleet age today? Where am I in terms of the mean distance between service failures? And then also what percent of the fleet is typically under repair? What's my spare vehicle ratio? So there are defaults for all these parameters, but to the extent you have any of this data, you enter it in the tool. And in this slide, it looks like the font's got a little screwy, but these are additional advanced parameters that you can enter if you have the data. So headway standard deviation, how much is the failure rate increasing per year, how much are passengers delayed in the event of a vehicle failure, and then what are the various adjustment factors. And I see we had a couple of questions about adjustment factors. We'll talk more about that. We do have defaults for all this, but which are in some cases computed from the data entered in the basic parameters, but you can enter that in as well. So once you've entered in this information, what the tool will show you is this graph, and then also a table of results. So in the graph, you see the average fleet age plotted on the horizontal axis, and the EJT per passenger, so the journey time per passenger trip in minutes on the horizontal axis. And the red dotted line shows you the current value, and then the blue line, the solid line, shows the predicted value over time. And typically what you'll see is that journey time doesn't vary too much as a function of condition. This is the case of a bus where the useful life is 12 years. So up to 12 years it does vary a little bit, but it doesn't vary too much. But then as an asset goes beyond its useful life, then you start to see this exponential increase. The next slide shows the result for a few basic scenarios. So the top bar shows EJT for the base case with the buffer time, wait time, and in-vehicle time. The fleet aged 5 years relative to the base case, the fleet aged 10 years relative to the base case, and the new fleet. And in this case, you see the journey time increasing as the fleet gets older and improving a little bit for a new fleet. There's also, this information is shown in a table as well down below the graph. So here, letting the fleet age 10 years results in a 15% increase in journey time. And a new fleet, conversely, reduces journey time by about 3%. And then there's detailed results by fleet ages, just showing what's plotted on the graph. So there's some key assumptions to the simplified model. We're assuming frequent service where passengers can arrive anytime during a headway. They don't plan their arrivals based on the headway. Their buffer time is predicted, but it includes only the variation in wait time. We assume that passengers stand while they're waiting and sit while they're riding. And headways do get adjusted based on fleet availability. So if a lot of the fleet is out of service because of failures, then the headway gets adjusted, and that actually has a big impact on the journey time. We use defaults for things like mean distance between failure and increase in the failure rate over time from some previous research, TCRP report 157. And then we use some defaults for adjustment factors, but the adjustment factors obviously are very important. And if you change the adjustment factors, that's going to impact your results. I see we have some questions, and we'll definitely get to the questions once we get through the presentation, but I do appreciate the questions. There's a lot of assumptions and issues you may want to ask about on this. So in the comprehensive model, this is doing a similar thing. It's predicting effective journey time per passenger, but it includes the buffer. This one will predict in-station time if you want to, wait and vehicle time. This one predicts predicts some of the same things, but requires a lot of additional input. And I'll just walk parameters through some of the key parameters in this one. So here we need vehicle parameters, similar parameters for vehicles as we had for the simplified model. And then here we need to have a little bit more detail on our service. So we need to say how many stations or stops we have, and how many unlinked passenger trips there are, what the headway is, standard deviation of the headway, and that will, again, that will be calculated if you don't put it in. and then what type of guideway you have and the guideway failure rate. And then I don't have the screenshot here, but you need to also put in information for each stop or station. So the way we express the origin destination data we have is you put in the list of stations or stops and you say what percent of the riders are boarding at each of those stops, and what of those, what percent are going inbound versus outbound or eastbound versus westbound. You put in your labels for what the two different directions are. And then there's a lot of optional parameters that you don't have to enter, but you can enter. If you want to calculate in-station conveyance time, you can put in things like a comfort factor for the platform, walk time in each station, information on the failure rates on elevators and escalators, and so forth. And I underscore that's optional, but if you certainly can model in-station time if that's of interest. Also, there's information that's needed for each guideway section. The key thing that's needed is how long is each guideway section between each station or stop, and what's the average travel time, and then there's a variety of additional parameters you can put in as well. And these are predicted if you don't specify them. And then you have to specify similar information for the future case. So by default, we have you put in information for a worst case, like a really bad day, and a typical case. And so, for instance, you could say, how much older will the fleet be? What will the different adjustment factors be? What will the failure rate be? What will the headway be? And so forth. So it's the same parameters as before, but for these future cases. And this screenshot shows the results you get out. Essentially, you get out for your base case and for the future cases, the journey time per passenger, the journey time per passenger mile, and then the total journey time for all the passengers. And then that can be broken out by the buffer time, in-station time, wait time, and in-vehicle time. And then you get another bar chart. Here what we show in the bar charts, we show the unadjusted number. So if you don't apply any of these adjustment factors we're talking about, what is the number, as well as an adjusted number with the different adjustment factors. And as you said, we have a base case and then two future cases, and the system will average the future worst case and the future typical to give you an overall future average, if that's of interest. There's some key assumptions for the comprehensive model. I've just mentioned some of those. Again, we're assuming frequent service. What this means is that passengers don't plan when they're going to arrive based on the headway of the vehicles. They just arrive at the stop at any point during the headway. We're modeling a single line or route. Now you can, this is just a spreadsheet model. You can combine multiple spreadsheets if you want to combine it to look at an overall system. But in an individual spreadsheet that you open up, you're modeling an individual route. We do provide defaults for all the different adjustment factors, but you can override those and put in your own adjustment factors. And the key one that I'll mention is the in-vehicle comfort factor. And what we assume, and it's based on research cited in the research report, is that basically your journey time, your effective journey time is 20% greater. So you have a factor of 1.2 for a vehicle that's reached the end of its effective life versus a new vehicle. But that's certainly a key factor, and you can override that value. And also another key factor is the decision of whether in the future, if conditions deteriorate, whether the headways will need to be adjusted. And there's obviously a lot of factors that go into that calculation. The simplified model estimates the change in headway as things deteriorate. For the comprehensive model, it's really up to the analyst to specify that, and that's an important assumption. And then we rely on a couple of different TCRP reports to adjust factors in the future. TCRP report 157 for failure rates, and 165 has a model on the in-vehicle adjustment factor for crowding. Okay, and we do want to leave time for questions. I'll just very briefly go through a couple of examples, and these examples actually are detailed in the research report, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. I'll just mention that they're in the report, and so just walk through them very quickly. So the first example is of the EJT calculator, the simplified EJT calculator, I should say. In this example, Main Street Transit provides bus service to a small urban area and is interested in comparing EJT for two scenarios. What would our EJT improvement be if the bus fleet is replaced, or what would happen if we need replacement and the replacement of the fleet is deferred for 5 years? So in this case, we have a small number of inputs to put in. We have an average headway of 20 minutes, so we enter that value. An average fleet age, in this case we're assuming it's 10 years, and we enter a mean distance between failure and a percentage of fleet typically under repair. And then, and that's what we enter, and we get some results out of the system. In this particular case, if the fleet age is 5 years, we see an 8% increase in EJT. If it's aged 10 years, a 25% increase. And if we buy a new fleet, that's a 4% decrease. And then here's the same information in a bar chart. And from the tool, we can see that if we let, the answer to the question is, if we let the fleet deteriorate for an additional 5 years, then the journey time will increase by about 4 minutes per passenger. Conversely, if we go ahead and replace the fleet, we get a savings of 2 minutes per passenger. And if we multiply that out for this particular line, that savings or that benefit of replacing the fleet rather than allowing it to deteriorate is about $1.28 million a year. Now, obviously, as I said before, to make an overall decision about when to invest, you need to consider additional factors besides just the service quality, but hopefully that the tool can provide some useful information to help support that kind of decision. Okay, and the second example in the report is an example of the comprehensive calculator. In this particular example, we have an imaginary transit agency, Springfield Transit Authority, which provides bus and rail service in Springfield, USA. The central transit line is aging and needs investment, and there's slow zones on the system. And in the report, we walk through the analysis of a base case and 2 future cases. And so these slides just show the base case vehicle parameters and service parameters that one would enter into the model. We have to enter information on each station, so we have a list of stations and the percent of daily entries at each station and the directionality of those. And we also need to enter in information on the distance between each station and the travel time between each station, typically. And then we have a small number of parameters that we need to enter for our future case. And then based on that, we can get a result out of the model. And so this table shows the EJT per passenger going from 26 minutes in the base case and going up in the future worst case. Here, the future typical case is used to represent an improvement. So we're repurposing the case in the spreadsheet to do an alternative future prediction. And then I'm just briefly going through this because the details are in the report, but we can see the bar chart showing the EJT changes. And then the conclusions in this particular example are that letting the system deteriorate increases EJT by 0.2 minutes per passenger. Replacing the fleet and removing the slow zones reduces it by 3.2 minutes per passenger. And for this particular example, that works out to about $4 million annual benefit, considering the number of passengers on the system and the value of time for those passengers. So again, I went through that very briefly, but I encourage everybody who's interested to just look at the examples in the report and to take a look at the actual tools. So just to wrap things up and get to the questions, a few basic conclusions from our research. Through this research effort, we defined a measure of service quality that we termed EJT, and this measure does integrate a number of the dimensions of service quality that are affected by asset condition, including actual impacts of journey time, such as changes in headway, changes in delay from vehicle failures, and then perceived impacts in journey time, such as comfort of the vehicle that you're in, amount of time you spend standing versus sitting, and so forth. So, as Bob said, there's really no one good measure that can really adequately express all the different dimensions of service quality, but we think EJT gives you a measure that captures a lot of those components. What we saw from the case studies is that changes in asset condition really do impact service quality, and we can indeed quantify these changes using EJT. And so that's important. We wanted to have a measure that characterizes service quality, but also that actually varies as a function of asset condition. So EJT does achieve that for us. And through the research, we're able to develop this set of spreadsheet tools I just walked through for predicting EJT and changes in EJT. Now, we tried to make the tools as easy as possible to use, but we certainly appreciate that it takes time to use any sort of model. So this link here, you can use to download the report if you've not done so. In the report, we have some summary results for typical scenarios. So if you're looking for kind of the Cliff Notes version of the research, then this table sums it up. If you want to know what is the effect of taking a fleet that's running now at a typical service life and replacing it with a new fleet, what we see is that the improvement for bus or rail is typically about 5%. So in this case, our base case is about half the useful life. If we replace that with a new fleet, we typically would see a savings of 5% in effective journey time. On the other hand, if we let the fleet age to the point that it's at its useful life and then needs to be replaced, for a bus system, this would typically result in an increase in journey time of about 8%, and a rail system 10 to 12%. So that's significant, but it's even more significant if the fleet is aged past its useful life. So at 1.5 times the useful life, so about 18 years or so for a bus, depending on what your useful life is, that you'd see about a 38% in journey time. For a rail system, for a light rail system, 101% increase in journey time. Heavy rail, 63% increase. Now, adding speed restrictions further complicates things. So at the bottom row of this table, what you see is in the case that you let the fleet age to 1.5 times its useful life and you introduce extensive speed restrictions, then the increase in journey time is 109% for a light rail system and 70% for a heavy rail system. So at this point, if you're comparing making an SGR investment versus allowing a system to deteriorate, you really do see some significant impacts on service quality that should be considered in making investment decisions. So with that, we've gone through a recap of our research, and be happy to answer any questions you have. One last thing I would like to do is acknowledge the other folks that helped on this research effort. Diane Schwager from TRB was our program manager, and she kept the project on track as well as she could. And our panel members, some of whom are on this call, were very involved in the research and gave a lot of great feedback and really helped steer the research in as useful a direction as they could. Our panel chair was Steve Barang from NZTA, and in this slide you can see the other panel members who participated in the research. We also had liaisons from FTA and APTA, and we appreciate their assistance as well. So thanks very much to all of these folks, and be happy to answer any questions you have.
Great, thank you. I did copy down the questions that came in as we were going along. The first one came in all the way back at slide 20. It was from AJM, and it said, in case study 1, why wasn't the time savings 10 minutes if the 10 minutes of slow zones were reduced to negligible?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the case study 1, that's where we're looking at a heavy rail line, and the vehicle trip was increased by 10 minutes. The reason that you didn't see a 10-minute increase per passenger is because you'd only get that, the passenger would only experience that 10-minute increase if they were traveling the whole length of the train, the whole length of the trip. So for an individual passenger, we modeled where they got on and where they got off, and they certainly saw the effects of the slow zones, but they didn't, very few passengers rode the line from beginning to end and saw the full 10-minute increase.
Okay, hopefully that took care of that question. Around the same slide, another question came in from Houston Metro, and they asked, how did you calculate the dollar savings per minute of delay? For example, 4 minutes to 18 million.
Right, so there we had statistics on ridership, so riders per day, and we assumed, I think we used FHWA's value of time of $12.55 a minute, or sorry, an hour, and we multiplied the change in time by that, by the number of passengers by that value.
Great. Around slide 25, Laura Johnson wanted to know what makes up the vehicle comfort factor.
Yeah, that's a great question. So those adjustment factors, as I said earlier, are really important in the research. There were, so we didn't have the budget to try to go out and measure the comfort factor, but the way that it has been measured in different studies has been through typically through stated preference surveys, where passengers are asked, you know, how did this trip make you feel, and how much more would you have been willing to pay for this trip if you'd been on a new vehicle, or how much time would you be willing to sacrifice to ride on a new vehicle, or something like that. So the best data point we found was, I believe it was a New Zealand study where this question was asked of passengers straight up. So the adjustment factor of 1.2 is capturing basically the additional comfort that a user would perceive for being on a new vehicle with presumably more comfortable seats, but also just their sort of perception of the system being on a new vehicle. And obviously it's very subjective, and of course you can say, well, which new vehicle are we talking about, and which old vehicle are we talking about? Ideally there'd be more examples of research of this topic, but that was the best example we had was the New Zealand research effort. It was on buses, and they basically asked people straight up how much they would value having sort of an average fleet versus a new fleet versus a very old fleet.
Yeah, and just to kind of jump in on that, Laurie, I think it's about slide 28 where I put up some a table of some examples, and they are they are averages, and they will change from time to time. And I see there's another question asking about average city or average region. We're a small country, so yeah, that's the one. Yeah, and there's actually probably about 3 or 4 times that many when you're looking at EEM. So, you know, these sorts of things, they've probably got a statistical or a bell curve. I'm not sure whether they take the mean, the average, or something else. But of course, there's variation, and it is just simply basically an average that you can apply in an analysis. If you can get better information from your own city, fine. You know, it's market research, and I'm sure, you know, you can come up with it.
Yeah, in the research report, we have a table of the adjustment factors that we came up with from our literature review and the source of each of those. So it was certainly a key part of the research to try to get the most reasonable set of factors we could get. The EEM that Mark has mentioned is really a great source of this data, and the factors there were developed from the available research. The London journey time metric is another good source, and then there's various other sources that were available in the literature. But it was a bit of certainly one of the more challenging things was to try to get the various adjustments factors that we needed to get.
Anyone else? No? Okay. Around the same point in the presentation, John Cicino, I think that's how you say that. I'm sorry if I'm butchering everyone's names. How do you determine a true factor for applying the traveler's value of time when people perceive this value different?
I'll hop in and answer that one because you're on the same slide. And look, again, it's a similar answer to the one before. Everyone has a different perception. And what we've done here in the, actually it wasn't that slide, it was probably the one before actually, or the one after.
Before? I can back it up.
No, go the other way. Go the other way.
Oh, that's forward. Okay.
Yeah, that's it. That's the one. That's the one. So that's the value of time. And, you know, again, everyone's kind of different. But what we've done here is sort of try and look at the macroeconomic picture, if you like, to some degree, to say that if it's a work travel purpose, then there's a productivity aspect to it. Then there's commuting to and from work, and then other non-work related purposes, which are smaller, but they are still different. So we've sort of put that level of granularity to it. You know, you could do more, you could do less, but I think the big thing this recognises is the productivity one around work travel, if you can actually segregate out trips that are made for that purpose. The values are there, and they've been derived from, as I said, sort of research and economic analysis. And so if you can get more detail, it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, this is Bill. The only thing I'd add is just that it's hard to get the right value. I think what's important is probably to have a consistent value and to document your assumptions. A big part of the reason this research was performed is because it's hard to compare different types of investments an agency needs to make, and the intent was to provide more detail, more information about SGR investments that can improve decision making. In that light, I'd say if you're the asset manager or you're trying to do an analysis of an investment, you definitely want to look to what assumptions your transit agency is making when it looks at service improvements, and use common assumptions with others in the agency who are trying to value investments in improving service. And hopefully, you know, there are some reasonable default values that have been adopted by the agency that you can rely on.
Great. The next question came in at around slide 3940. It was from Graham Young. Are the IVT values presented typical for average city, or would these IVT values vary significantly from region to region? I will try to go over that way. Around here, I don't know. Let me know if that's not the right slide.
I suspect that it's a similar question to what we've just been discussing. That's the vehicle time values. I'm not sure, but it's a similar answer. It may vary from city to city or region to region, but it's about, you know, getting that kind of common standard, I guess. But I think we've got some replies coming in.
Graham says that it was answered already. Okay.
Good, good.
So let's move on. Okay. At slide 43, someone logged in as guest, so sorry, don't have more information. Oh, they wanted the password. Never mind, we've established that in the chat. They said that there was no password needed when they downloaded the spreadsheets. That's correct?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think that you should be able to just get them.
Yeah, I think there was some discussion at the midpoint, and before I realized that it had been answered, I had already noted it on my questions. Okay, so then around slide 69, 70, David Fogel asked, what is the impact of general vehicle overhauls on EJT? EIT? JT? JT, sorry. Should put my glasses on.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the simplified model, really what we're looking at is the mean distance between failures and how that increases as a function of age. What we're assuming in the model is that, that if the failure rate increases, if the failure rate doubles, for instance, whatever percent of vehicles you have in the shop is also going to double, which obviously is a pretty rough assumption, but that's the assumption we're making. So what it boils down to in the simplified model is that you have to, if you're going to do overhauls of the vehicles, you'd have to equate that to a change in mean distance between failures. If you can make that equivalent, you can put it in, you can see a result. In the comprehensive model, there's more dials to turn, but I think essentially that's the key relationship there as well. So, so vehicle overhaul, if it reduces the failure rate, then you're going to get a positive outcome from that. But we haven't tried to quantify that in the model. We don't have a did you overhaul the vehicles switch that you can flip. You'd have to say that, well, as a result of the overhaul, the vehicles are effectively younger, or you would have to enter the new mean distance between failures to simulate the effect of an overhaul.
Excellent. The last question I got in while the presentation was going on, and I apologize, I don't know if it's Jorge or George, because it could be either, and I'm not even trying your last name. Is it, how did you calculate the 12.55 time value, $12.55 time value?
Right, so that's a good question. So that one we got it from FHWA. Well, it's the number that was used for the most recent DOT conditions and performance report that we could get our hands on. And they, anyways, we use that value. But wow, you can get lots of different values depending on where you go. So, so I want to say it's a DOT default. I can't swear to that. It's definitely a number that was used and cited by FHWA.
Great. That was all the questions that I had saved during the presentation. So everyone who's still out there, if you do have a question you would like to ask, now would be the time to jump into the chat box and ask it. I'll wait a minute to see if anyone starts typing. Oh, okay. Peng Zhu, any suggestion of applying this tool to markets with different age groups, user expectation, ridership, etc.? For example, transit agency in Florida versus New York.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll bet you Bob has opinions about this. But I think you could use the concept of EJT and look at different market segments. We did have a lot of great discussion with our panel early on in the research about what the differences between different types of systems might be and how that would play into the research. We've tried to sort of characterize, talk about a typical system, but I mean, there's a lot of parameters in these models, and you could vary them for different demographics or for different systems. So for instance, if you have a system with a lot of choice riders, you might have, your adjustment factors would probably be a lot greater. If you have a lot of captive riders who are kind of going to ride the system no matter what, you may change the adjustment factors and ramp them down. In the extreme case, you may not want to use any of these adjustment factors if you're just concerned about, are the buses and trains going to show up on time? But I don't know if, Bob, you had other thoughts on this question.
Bill, I think you handled it appropriately.
Okay. The next question came in from Charles Weiland. Any thoughts on vertical circulation component of the journey?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad somebody asked about that. So in the research, we did see some examples of where people had looked at in-station time. And I don't remember the authors, but there was a really nice paper from Hong Kong where they had looked at that, and where the station itself was the capacity constraint on the system, and they were very concerned with improving throughput through the stations. So, and you can think of systems in the U.S. where this could be an issue in New York or maybe Washington D.C. Where this the in-station component could be really important. So what we've got in our model is an ability to add the in-station component. So you can put in the travel time in the station, and you could put in basically the failure rate of elevators and escalators. I think we may have parameters for saying what % of people use the elevators and escalators versus walk, and the additional time it takes if you have to walk. So we'd like to think that everything's there for somebody to look at this, and I think it can certainly be important, at least for for a fixed guideway system where either there's a lot of in-station time or where the station is emerging as kind of one of the choke points of the system. But it's not, we didn't have any U.S. data to look at this, and so we weren't able to look at this issue in any of our case studies. But I think it's a great area for certain situations, and we think that the models will apply to it.
Great. I don't see any other questions. Charles said he'll take a look. Thanks. And Peng said thank you for your earlier answer. I guess I'm going to put out the final call for questions, because we're very close to the hour-and-a-half mark allotted for this session. I know people have to get back to their grind. Last call. Is anyone typing? All right. Does anybody have any final words before I read my little closing thing? Bill, Mark,
Thanks, Lori,
Robert?
for organizing it. We appreciate your help.
Thank you, Lori.
Thank you to the three of you. This was great. Huge turnout. So I'd like to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. A special thank you to Bill, Bob, and Mark for their informative presentation. Just a reminder, everyone on here today will be receiving an invitation to fill out an evaluation. We really appreciate the feedback, so if you could just take a couple minutes and fill that out, that would be wonderful. We're almost to the weekend, so everyone enjoy, well, everyone in my time zone, enjoy the rest of Thursday. People elsewhere, it's already Friday, so
Correct.
enjoy your day.
Yep.
Have a good one. Thanks, everyone.